And if you at least think through, if you at least set up a framework of how you'll make the decision, that when the moment comes, you'll already have considered the weight of variables, you'll be less impacted in the moment. And so the way we did that on Pikes Peak, before the hike started, I knew that I wanted to be off the summit by noon. I knew we had decided that before the hike started. I knew that, hey, in order to avoid the afternoon's thunderstorms, we need to be about 90 minutes, about 2,000 feet below the summit. And when we took refuge under the rock, I was looking at my watch, and I knew that there was a time at which continuing was no longer possible. Even though there was this emotional investment of wanting to succeed, I knew that we should be off the summit by noon, and we had already thought all of that through. And so for me, it was a little bit of just a math problem while the clock played out with the clouds. And I think that's a pretty good model for high stakes decision making that weeds the biases out of the equation.
Hello and welcome to the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the Chief Medical Officer. I am your host, Lee Scheinbart, and along with a fabulous team at the CMO Group, we bring you the most crucial conversations in healthcare and physician leadership. The CMO Group is the only physician-run organization that exists to transform how Chief Medical Officers lead. The group helps CMOs and emerging physician leaders move from expert operators to enterprise leaders through a unique transformational process. Healthcare doesn't just need good doctors and leadership, it needs high-powered executives with deep medical knowledge. That transformation is the work of the CMO Group. Today's guest comes to us direct from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, our nation's #1 leadership academy. And if you are at all interested in what leadership means, what competencies are required, and what are some of the most crucial skills to attain in leadership, then listen up. Our guest today is Colonel Michael Kloepper, a Brigade Tactical Officer for the U.S. Corps of Cadets at the United States Military Academy, where he serves as the Director of Leader Development and Character. The Colonel is a 1997 USMA graduate himself, a 2015 graduate of the Keenan Flagler Business School at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and a 2021 distinguished graduate of the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He is an infantry officer, Ranger qualified, and a master parachutist. Mike has deployed iteratively to both Afghanistan and Iraq in a variety of staff and command positions. Notably, his assignments include command of Company A, 1st Ranger Battalion, command of 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry Airborne, command of 3rd Ranger Battalion, and command of the 173rd Airborne Brigade. His awards and decorations include the Combat Infantry's Badge, Legion of Merit, Bronze Star with Valor, and the Purple Heart. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for the warm introduction. It's a little bit awkward for me, but I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, I asked you to provide it, so I'm just reading what you shared.
I didn't know you were going to do an on-air reading. I would have been a little bit briefer.
Well, it'll all work out in the end, as they say. And anyway, I do appreciate you doing this, and I'm very impressed by your role in leadership development. And in fact, why don't we start with what got my attention? You write on Substack, and we'll talk about that at the end, and you put out an essay with 2 of your boys. You have 3 boys, correct?
I do, yeah.
And you took 2 of them on a hiking trip up Pikes Peak, and later when you reflected on what happened, you wrote about it. So could you just tell us a little bit about that day?
Yeah, I appreciate it. So just by happenstance, we're an avid hiking family. I think we really took to the outdoors during COVID. It just seemed like a natural place for us to spend time together in a way that was healthy and productive. And so this has really progressed. So about 3 weeks ago, maybe a month ago, I flew out to Colorado Springs to hike Pikes Peak with my oldest son, who's serving in the Army out there. And my youngest son, who's 18. And just sort of for context, Pikes Peak it's a difficult, though relatively safe climb. It's mostly a walk. It's about 24 miles round trip with quite a bit of elevation gain, but it's accessible and it's relatively safe, but physically challenging. If there is a risky part to it, if there is something that's dangerous to it, it would be the weather exposure, specifically in the afternoon. That in the mountains, in the Rocky Mountains, storms will roll through pretty fast and unexpectedly. And so you want to thread the needle in the way you manage your time during the day and just be up and off the summit before the storms roll in. So my oldest boy and my youngest son and I were probably 2,000 or 3,000 feet from the summit when a hailstorm rolled in pretty fast on us. A lightning hailstorm rolled in shockingly fast. And so the three of us sought cover within these rocks and got ourselves safe pretty quickly. And within just a few minutes, this other group, two women and a man, all in their mid-30s, joined us underneath our rock. And so we had this ad hoc little group of people huddled under the rock, trying to decide what to do. And it was fascinating. I watched this other group go through the decision making of whether or not they should stay in a position of safety or venture out into the weather. And just by happenstance, I mean, they became characters in a story. I watched this unfold like a story. Just by happenstance, the two women were clearly experienced in the outdoors and understood the risks that were incumbent within the environment. And the guy they were with seemed like he was a less experienced but louder voice. And he was able to talk them into the consensus of leaving comfort and leaving safety and venturing further into the storm. And it was a pretty violent storm with active thunder and lightning and hail, and it was clearly not the right decision to do. But for me, it was an expose at that time of how human decision making works and how we can, if not be talked into, we can be talked into a consensus. We can find comfort, a consensus of doing things that we know are not quite right. I'll pause there.
Hearing it is as good, if not better, than the writing, because I can envision this. And when I was a young boy, I was canoeing in the Boundary Waters canoe area in Minnesota, north of Ely, Minnesota. And you're really at the edge of wilderness. And myself and another fellow was in a canoe, and we had 6 of us total, and so 3 canoes. And we were old enough that the scoutmaster said, "You guys can go on the other side of the lake and camp." And midway through this, a storm came up out of nowhere, some cold front down from Canada, and we capsized. And one of the other canoes capsized. And we had all of our Boy Scout skills at the ready, in the midst of being completely terrified. And we lost some of our gear. We lost a lot of our food, even though it was tied into the canoe.
Yep.
But what you remind me of is this thinking fast, thinking slow. That comes from Dan Kahneman's book, just like you reference in your article, how we arrive at decisions, how we arrive at consensus, whether we default to the fast mode or the slow, thoughtful mode. This is a long way of getting to how decisions are made are very different in different settings with different reasons. And it requires a whole set of skills and we're going to walk through this on this podcast in just a moment, how you make decisions. And for physicians who have been trained, much like soldiers, who have been trained to carry out certain executive functions, for lack of a better word, either there's an objective to meet on a mission, or in your training, there's certain competencies you have to acquire. A surgeon, and I know your brother's a surgeon, has to go through a very rigorous process, and it leaves very little room for the decision making in the moment, because you have to rely on an ability to just simply be decisive. In the OR, when everything's going to hell, you have to be trained well enough to know what to do right in that moment. If you have a choice in the matter, you rarely ask everyone in the surgical suite, "Hey, what does everybody think here? And let's stop while the bleeding goes on and figure out what to do." And it's that transition of not doing that in the OR. And it is required in an executive meeting room where you do want to solicit input and come up with a decision at risk of making the wrong decision, like these hikers that you met, and perhaps like us when we got out into the storm and we should have waited until it passed. So, great starting point. Are you ready for some of the questions I want to ask?
I'm 100% ready. I will share with you. So I grew up in scouting. I'm a lifelong scouter. All of my kids were scouts. So I'm familiar with like the dynamic you just described. I'm familiar with the Boundary Waters, high adventure area, and all like everything that you just described. I've got vivid memories of. And you sort of put my hair on end because I've been an adult leader in the Boy Scouts, and I'm just imagining these kids like in a pretty high risk situation. So I completely understand.
Yeah, and for better or for worse, it has shaped me in part as to
That's right.
who I am and what I'm capable of.
That's right.
Surviving capsizing in a storm, or sitting, a couple thousand feet from the peak of a mountain, will train a young man. So your two boys, I'm sure this story and that experience will stay with them forever. So well done, Dad.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
All right. So look, for our listeners, so Mike, you spent about 3 decades or so leading soldiers in increasingly complex organizations. What leadership lessons have proven to be universal, regardless of whether you're leading an infantry battalion, a military academy, or in this case, for our listeners, a healthcare organization?
Yeah. So I really appreciate the question. And in preparing for the podcast, I've been thinking a lot about the parallels between the military as a profession and healthcare as a profession. And the parallels, I think, on the surface they're very different, but not so much, because both have leaders that are working in pretty ambiguous circumstances where the answer is not immediately clear, and the answer will not necessarily have an immediately clear or predictable outcome. So even under the best of circumstances, there's a little bit of lack of predictability, and the stakes are really high. And so what we're talking about is decision making within the context of uncertainty, with with results that are not completely predictable. Sometimes we get unanticipated outcomes because of factors beyond our control. And so it's with that lens that I'm walking into the conversation and hopeful to add a little bit to it, to your development of the chief medical officer in that ecosystem. I think the two principal attributes that we look for and where I think there would be a lot of transferability. The first being character, we can disaggregate character into a series of sub attributes and how those can be developed. But character being the aggregation of what we do, say, and believe, character being how we treat each other, character being a manifestation of our honesty and integrity and our humility and our empathy for other humans. And so I think character being a principal component, and then the second component, just in a very basic sense, being our technical competence in your profession, being that hands on in the OR, and the technical competence to be able to deliver healing treatment and protocols without deviation or hopefully negative outcomes. And so those would be the two attributes, the competence and character, that I think sort of fit like a yin and yang to build a professional.
Yes, and two problems that occur for our physician listeners that are aspiring to take on these roles and these responsibilities. Medical school does a fine job of teaching you the foundation work to go into your training to become a competent, skilled surgeon, or a specialist, or even a generalist requires a tremendous amount of competencies and skills. They're just different skills. And yet the character piece comes through our professionalism, which is true in soldiering as well. But it is about the patient having empathy and understanding and working within that moment in clinic or in the OR of what is most important to that person and what you can do for that person. What is challenging for physicians moving into titled formal leadership roles is they don't have the same level of competencies and skills in leading other people. And in fact, the character element of you can be very, very sympathetic and empathic with your patients. And then you get into the executive room and you can be a bit of a jerk. And suddenly, no one cares that you're the most credible physician on the medical staff. That's not how this room works. And all this empathy that you showed in clinic 2 hours ago, it evaporated when you walked into the room. And I think physician leaders have to be conscientious of their self and the others in the room and begin to take on new skills to expand that character in the new room and develop new competencies. So I'm curious if you have any suggestions relative to that.
Yeah, so I think your observation is spot on, and I would observe that there's a dynamic where the things that get us promoted are the technical competencies that we display early in our profession, whether it's in the ER or the OR or in clinical practice, or for me it would be the integration of artillery into maneuver. There's a technical competency to the profession. There's a science to the profession. And demonstrating mastery in those early years, maybe your first decade, your first 15 years, demonstrating the mastery in those technical skills is what'll get you promoted, but it's not necessarily those same skills that you need to thrive as you enter a position of leadership. And I think it takes a pretty high degree of humility to recognize that the things that you've done to this moment to be successful are not necessarily the same skills, qualities, and attributes that you need to be able to demonstrate into the future to be successful, especially if you're transitioning from being, and I don't use the word individual contributor lightly, but if you're going from being a member of a small team or a small team leader or the expert in your domain, the expert in the OR, the expert in the ER, if you're going from being the technical expert to an organizational leader where you're managing multiple departments and a profit and loss statement and making decisions of risk, not only life and death risk, but organizational viability risk, it's a different skill set. And I think the bridge between those two things is a sense of humility and a willingness to learn new things, which, if I can just make one more statement, can be really difficult when you've demonstrated mastery in a profession. It can be really difficult to show that humility when you've had unadulterated success until that moment.
Couldn't agree with you more that what there's healthy tension and unhealthy tension in my world. That the healthy tension is that I'm able to look in the mirror and realize I have been the master of the universe at the bedside for 20 years. I am nobody in this executive room. And there's a healthy awareness that if it develops and you draw back on your humility and say, I've got to take a time out and I have to understand this new environment that I'm working. The unhealthy tension is the individual who takes the title, takes the role, takes the responsibilities, and doesn't put a mirror up and doesn't appreciate their own humility and just marches in and is a bit of a Tasmanian devil. And those individuals don't really last very long for a variety of reasons. But what I'm going to put forth is perhaps the notion that humility is a little bit of a key in a lock equation to master that tension. So if you find yourself struggling, so this is for my listeners out there, if you're struggling the first 90, 180 days on the roll, go look in the mirror and sit with yourself for a little bit and see if you can generate some humility and say, what is it about me that's making this transition difficult? And then go ask for help, get some resources, get developed, and begin to understand there's a new set of skills to master. And I quote Marshall Goldsmith all the time, what got you here won't get you there.
That's right. It's 100%. And it seems like, one of the things I had talked about in the Substack essay that you just sort of sparked this memory we can really become subject to, it's called confidence bias,
Yeah, talk
overconfidence
talk a little
bias.
bit about. I remember that from the essay. Talk about that.
Yeah, so especially when you're doing really well in your profession and you've enjoyed a series of successes and you make the right decisions and you get good outcomes, and there's a lot of positive affirmation, whether that's through your evaluations or the way your financial compensation or whatever the method is, you can start to believe, all of us, by the way, in whatever the profession, you can start to believe in your own hype and your own infallibility. And in doing that, that's when you set yourself up to have a structural cognitive blind spot to start making really bad decisions, because you become overconfident. Your confidence outpaces your competence and you can make bad decisions.
You may remember the movie Scarface with Al Pacino and Michelle Pfeiffer.
Yes.
There's a
Yes,
famous line. They're in the disco, and Tony is learning all about the illicit drug trade, and Michelle Pfeiffer is totally checked out. But the phrase that comes up is "never get high on your own supply,"
that's
and
right.
that's basically what what you're saying, and you're spot on. At least in the universe that I work in, it will damage you if you allow that overconfidence and that constant affirmation of your ability. I'm not saying it's not important in moments of life and death. I'm sure in combat, it's critically important. You're trained well, you're disciplined, you have prepared for uncertainty, and you act accordingly. And same in critical life or death situations in the hospital. But in an executive room where you're saving lives one meeting at a time, you can slow down and you can really take a pause and think, what am I saying? How am I contributing? Am I producing value here, or am I just a big mouth hoping that everybody listens to me and we'll go out into the storm to get to the peak, right? Like, right? Are we saying the same thing?
100%, 100%. And the idea that we can slow down a little bit when the stakes are high, but don't have the same level of urgency necessarily. They don't have the same level of acute urgency. It's a little bit idiosyncratic to my own experience, but we'll say pretty regularly, like, hey, we can just take a breath. Nope, nobody's gonna hit an IED on the way to work today. Like, it's okay. Like, everybody just breathe. We can talk this out a little bit. It's not as urgent as it feels.
Well, urgency is, whether we walk into medical school with it, we certainly walk out with it. Trained to be, and I heard you mention on another podcast, the notion of adrenaline and cortisol, and I don't care what specialty you're in, it is easy to be ego animated and thrilled by what the brain and neurochemistry does to you. And it's hard to come down, and we can talk about that a little bit more, but I think we're saying the same thing again.
100%.
But it leads to this question. We have these young listeners, they're taking a time out, they're pausing, they're reflecting. How might they also avoid, either for themselves and the teams they lead or the teams that they are reporting up to, help avoid that overconfidence bias? How do you help make better decisions and consensus? Do you have any tools or tricks to share?
Yeah. So it was Daniel Kahneman wrote in his book Noise. So just to give credit where credit's due, he he described, and what I found pretty good success with, is that you can mitigate the risk of a lot of our biases. Like, it, and I don't mean to use the word bias in a way that's charged, but rather bias in a way that would impact our decision making, the heuristic and cognitive shortcuts that we take to make decisions. Confidence bias, halo bias, optimist bias, the list goes on and on. And so what he describes is that you can mitigate a lot of those if you think through the formula or the algorithm of the protocol of the decision that you're going to have to make before you're faced with it. If you at least set up a framework of how you'll make the decision, that when the moment comes, you'll already have considered the weight of variables, you'll already have considered the emotionality of variables, you'll already have considered a lot of those things objectively, and will be less impacted in the moment. And so to use the previous example, the way we did that on Pikes Peak, before the hike started, I knew that I wanted to be off the summit by noon. I knew we had decided that before the hike started. I knew that, hey, in order to avoid the afternoon's thunderstorms, we need to be about 90 minutes, about 2,000 feet below the summit by about 1:30, and you back that up, and that's noon. And so I was paying attention to our rate of movement all morning. And when we took refuge under the rock, I was looking at my watch, and I knew that there was a time at which continuing was no longer possible. Even though we had flown from New York to Denver and rented a car and driven to Colorado Springs and had a huge investment in time, I took off work. There's a investment in money. There was this emotional investment of wanting to succeed. I knew that safety, we should be off the summit by noon. And we had already thought all of that through. And so for me, it was a little bit of just a math problem while the clock played out with the clouds. And I think that's a pretty good model for high stakes decision making that weeds the biases out of the equation.
Are you familiar with the timeout protocol?
I'm not, but no, please share.
Yeah, so the origin really is when you get on a commercial flight, and I'm sure the same is true when you all get in helicopters. There's a checklist that the pilot and the co-pilot go through
Yep.
for everybody's safety, and it's absolutely true in the commercial industry. And you will lose your job like on the spot if you flunk that checklist. And so over time in healthcare, that we brought checklists into the OR and other high state situations where you have a moment. Sometimes you don't, like when you're running a code blue. But it's called a timeout, and it's sort of the pre-surgical prep list. Do we have everything? Do we understand the conditions? Do we know what the patient had or didn't have yesterday? So on and so forth. And what you describe relative to Pikes Peak is you took some of the unknown variables. In other words, weather is, we know what weather is, but we don't always know when the
That's
weather
right.
is.
That's right.
And so you go through this checklist, this timeout. You could apply that to a high stakes meeting, is what I'm hearing you say. And in healthcare, some of the meetings are brutally high stakes, some are less so. But you can do a pre-meeting prep, and if you're going, you can do it in your mind, or you can do it with your colleague if the two of you are going in, share some notion and walk through some of that and be prepared for what may be some variables so that you don't quickly get anchored or that confirmation bias or all those heuristics that you mentioned bog you down. Stay on task and stay on the objective of what you're trying to accomplish in the meeting. Otherwise, don't have the meeting because you may find yourself getting sideways very quickly.
100%. And what I'd share is, so I've seen that. I've seen that done. We've got very similar protocols. The best leaders I've worked for have done sort of like a pre-meeting prep in which they anticipate the friction points on the agenda. They anticipate the emotionality that those things are going to bring. That way, when it happens, they're a little bit prepared for it. I've also seen really good leaders in which I'm aspiring to be. So please, I wouldn't want you or your listeners to think that like I've knocked this out of the park. I'm certainly learning, but I've seen really good leaders think deliberately about the emotionality that they want a meeting to have. And they will think deliberately, hey, when we walk out of this meeting, this is how I want people to feel. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a feel-good meeting. They may walk out feeling a sense of urgency. They may walk out
Right.
feeling a sense of admonishment. They may walk out feeling a sense of reward, positivity, whatever it is, but they are deliberate in thinking through the emotional outcome of a meeting because it's that emotionality that will drive the subsequent behavior, whatever that is. And they'll be pretty thoughtful in doing that.
I think that's a brilliant insight. And yes, I've seen that on occasion with very talented that takes a tremendous amount of learning and experience to carry that out. Because as a physician, and I tried to draw these analogies because I try to give people quick, ready tools tomorrow or this afternoon they can begin to work on as they're going from bedside to boardroom. So the idea that if I'm at a bedside and I order the patient like here's a prescription. In the old days, we actually wrote it and handed it to them. Now it's electronic. But it's like by my command, you will take this medication every night, and your problem will be better. You can't use that tactic in an by my order, you will do this. But you can say to the patient, look, there's this medication. There's a couple of side effects over here. There's this medication, costs a little bit more, side effects are a little bit less. And you try to bring people to the place that they want to be brought to, and using influence and some of that emotional awareness of the room that you're in. I too am still learning how to do all of the things you just described, but any physician can do this. You've already been trained to do this at the bedside. You just have to walk in and not write the prescription, but you have to provide some choices, maybe some recommendations, and steer people in a direction by which they walk out feeling as though the decision was worthy of everybody's time and attention.
Yeah.
So this is some good stuff. I want to go on to something else.
Yep.
You ready for the next one?
I'm ready.
So one of the things we're dancing around a little bit is sort of the importance of relationships as leaders assume greater responsibility. And as I just hinted at, how influence plays a role. I know you've written and spoken about how influence can become more powerful than authority. And I wonder if you have any thoughts you can expand around that subject.
I do. So truth in lending. Um, I want to start with empathy, if it's okay. So having been in the Army for 30 years, we didn't really start talking about empathy until about 2015, 2016. There was a series of books, a couple like Simon Sinek books had sort of woven their way into the contemporary leadership lexicon. And to be honest with you, there was not like a lot of empathy when I first joined the Army in 1997. It was just, it was just not part of our vocabulary. And I was a little bit of a non-believer. However, I've come around, and here's why. I think people who are thoughtful and reflective and deliberately empathetic, and when I say empathetic, I'm trying to describe the condition of understanding another person's perspective. And so if you're able to truly understand another person's perspective, then ideally you'd be able to better communicate with them in a way that will resonate with them. You're able to craft your language, you're more likely to be able to build a bridge between you through communicating. And if that happens, you are more likely to have a relationship, and that relationship is more likely to be trusting. And all of a sudden, the idea that you can influence them in a way that is not only tied to your authority, but in a way that is tied to very, very informal power structures like expert power and referent power. And because they trust you, your ability to influence them based off of a mutual respect becomes really, really significant. But it all starts with understanding their perspective and communicating to them in a way that will have resonance given their perspective. And I think very similar to what you described within the medical profession, the idea that in the Army, you just tell people what to do. It's not, I mean, maybe kind of, sort of, we certainly have got the formal structures for that, but it is a large organization with a lot of competing interests. And certainly the best leaders are the ones who are able to build coalitions and build positive, thoughtful consensus and lead through influence vice just raw authority. The outcomes are much, much better.
Yeah, and I wonder if this applies, and you tell me because you've done soldiering and I have not. That at a squad level, right? How many people are in a squad generally?
Nine.
Nine,
By the book, there's nine.
right? And there's math behind sort of the social
That's right.
science of why that number exists. But in that setting, and you have a squad leader, and they usually have a rank of some sort.
That's right. The squad leader will be a staff sergeant. He's like a early career professional, probably 5 to 7 years in the Army.
And so this is an assumptive question on my part. Would it be reasonable to assume that the staff sergeant is more likely in that setting to actually give and or order people, like give orders, order people to do things. And it's relatively effective in the small group, and they've in theory come together and
Yeah.
bonded over. So, but as leaders rise, you cannot just order like a battalion to do so. I mean, you can, but there's a chain of command by which the orders flow down all the way down to that 9-person squad. But the person in charge of the battalion, and you've been in these commanding officer roles, who you're working who you work with and up to requires a tremendous amount of patience and influence, and it isn't a bunch of orders at the very top level, although there's always some final order given somewhere. Does this make any sense to you, what I'm describing?
100%. And I would describe, so the difference in what you're describing is the difference between direct and organizational level leadership. And direct leadership being both a manifestation, or direct leadership being when you're leading a small group in which you have subject matter dominance. So in our case, that squad leader's been in the Army 7 years, and he is leading, or she is leading, men and women who have been in the Army 2 years. And so they have a significant amount of professional credibility and competence that their soldiers, just by virtue of where they are, don't necessarily have. So you've got a small group with wide disparity in experience. As you become an organizational leader, obviously that your span of influence grows far beyond 7 or 8 people, and the difference in experience, that gap starts to close significantly as well, to the point that you're leading people with the same background, the same educational platform, the same number of years within the profession. And so the expertise that you once relied on as your authoritative base doesn't necessarily have the same weight and credibility. I'll share with you. So my current boss is a general officer, and he certainly has a ton of lawful authority over how I perform my job. We're also the same age, with the same number of years in the Army and the same experiences. And so because he's a good leader, he relies on a broader set of tools than just his authority. He relies on a set of informal, influential tools to get us to form as a team and do his bidding, for lack of a better word.
I get it, and I want some of the listeners to pick up on this, what we're talking about. I use a phrase, it was taught to me, the higher you go in healthcare, the farther away you get from the work, which means the farther away you get from the bedside.
That's right.
And to the squad level, to the battalion level, to your level, the higher you go, the farther away that you will be effective if you're just giving those directives, those direct orders. Now, there's protocols, there's processes, there's regulations. You have them, we have them, we all understand. Those are part and parcel of how certain things get done. But the higher you go, that sort of bedside mentality just doesn't carry the same water and the same weight. And I think I'm hearing you describe that in this unique relationship. You have a strong leader, but for all intents and purposes, you're more or less equal in terms of years experience and age, and I imagine he served in combat as well, and yet technically that's your boss.
It's my boss. And it's his power to give us, for him to empower us.
Hmm.
And so I think that's also an important thing, is that great leaders share power. Great leaders empower others. They lift others up to do their best. Whereas conversely, if you just, if you're imparting instructions through the authoritative manner that you described, especially at the organizational level, you are effectively disempowering people. And I don't know necessarily what the equivalent is in the medical profession, but nobody's really looking for a subordinate who only does what they're told, because they won't do much.
Well, I think to your point about the 1990s and empathy in the armed forces, or particularly in the Army, wasn't an obvious or yet acceptable format. I think what we're learning in healthcare is the notion of psychological safety, and we need We need people to speak up, and we need people to call things out and do it in a respectful, mindful, appropriate way. What we need is people to speak up and say, there may be harm here because of X, Y, and Z. Doctor, could we just call a timeout for just 1 second? I want to redo the sponge count one more time.
Yep.
I would just want to be sure that there's nothing left, no foreign body in the OR. So it's the notion of developing psychological safety, which goes back to developing trust. And one thing I heard you say is that empathy is the notion of understanding somebody else's perspective. One of the most difficult things I think in healthcare organizations by the professions of physicians. I can't speak to nursing. I can't speak to respiratory therapy. The physicians will show zero vulnerability, none. And the white coat, I'm the demigod of this moment, and I will not show you what I'm hurting. I don't even have a hurt locker. I mean, I don't even know what that means. I compartmentalize and I trash it. The failure to show the vulnerability um, makes an uneven distribution around the trust factor. Because if I understand you, Mike, and I understand your perspective and your experiences to the best of my ability, I don't know all your context, but I'm picking up what you're putting down. I beginning to understand your point of view, but I don't show any vulnerability on my part. It's not a two-way trust equation because you're going to be a little distrustful of me. I extracted all this from you. I get you a little bit. I understand you. I influence you. But where's the two-way street? Because I'm all cloaked in the white coat. What are you thinking? I see you nodding.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I'm just thinking about the best leaders that I've had are secure enough in themselves that they can just be authentic. And they're able to say, I have had a long career and I haven't gotten it right every time. And I've made a couple of mistakes. And that's part of the experience set that I'm walking in today with. And, we're just going to do our best. And they have all of the technical competencies and institutional trust to be able to say that without anybody thinking the lesser of
Yeah, that takes some humility to do that. So we're going full circle here on
them.
some of
That's
this.
right.
Well, I got two questions.
Yeah.
One is more important than the next one, but to try to tie some of this together. Um, Throughout your career, and as you've suggested, you're still learning, you're still growing, and this is important to the theme of how physicians need to go through some level of transformation to become a more effective formal leader in a healthcare organization. Are there any habits or mindsets that you've had to unlearn to becoming more effective and leading at larger and more complex levels within the Army?
So for us, the inflection point happens at about year 13. At about year 13 for an Army officer is about when you move from direct leadership to organizational level leadership, and your span of control will go. So within your first decade, you'll lead up to about 110 soldiers. And then in your mid career years is when that'll expand to a battalion level and you'll lead several hundreds of people. And I think the what I wrestled with and what I think a lot of people wrestle with is is the ability to let go a little bit and to allow others to learn through experience. Because by year 13, you've got pretty good mastery of a lot of things and you can do things faster and maybe with a little, it's just easier. I'll just do it myself. Just to say it plainly, I'll just do that myself.
Right.
But when you do that, you're interrupting the development of the next generation. You're interrupting someone else's progression through the profession. And so for me, that was challenging. And I definitely see that as a challenge. That's a pretty systemic challenge as folks become organizational leaders, is using the task at hand, whether it's in the OR or the UR or for us out on the artillery range, as the place where development for the next generation happens.
So that's fabulous. That's really insightful. So unfortunately in healthcare, we don't really have a structured organizational ladder like that. And
No.
I know everybody who serves in the Army doesn't always have the opportunity to go up in the ranks. So I do understand
Yeah,
that.
that's right.
But it is formalized within the organization of the armed forces and of the Army in particular. And medicine doesn't have that. There's a lot of tapping on the shoulder. Hey, would you be the chair of surgery for the next 2 years? Would you sit as the chair of the quality committee and peer review and all these things that we get asked to do, and we do them somewhat willingly. And then one day, usually without intention, you are elevated to like a chief medical officer. Well, although it is my belief now that we can generate more intentionality and provide the curriculum and the coursework and the books to become an effective leader through influence of a medical staff, even if you have zero authority over the medical staff. And that's its own dynamic, and that's a show for another day. But I think the idea that if you are going to go up that ladder, one of the key elements to make you a better leader is to think about developing the people around you and that serve in their particular roles. I think that is really, it's like teaching. I mean, it makes you better when
That's
you
right.
have to provide instruction. In the academic medical center, that's a very profound element, except that then you're rewarded for that incredible intellectual and academic prowess, and that reward gets you in trouble more often than not, because then you cannot function in a department meeting because you think you're so brilliant and nobody else really cares. But again, another discussion. All right, last question, sir, before we wrap it up. Have you any piece of advice that you would offer our listeners baked out of this show or anything else that's been on your mind as we've been talking?
I think the only other observation I would make, and I don't know necessarily that this is advice, but maybe an extension to your last question in the form of advice. When you become an organizational leader within the medical profession, a chief medical officer or a department head or what be it, that you become responsible for the culture of that organization. And the culture of that organization is a manifestation of your leadership. People will respond to the way you act. You become, for better or worse, for good or bad, for good or evil, you become a beacon within that organization. And it's like maybe one of those little kid toys where you put the magnet on the thing, and all the iron filings will line up to the magnet. Organizational leaders have that impact on the culture of their organization. And I think it's worth remembering that the decisions we make both have an immediacy of effect of whatever the problem is that we're solving, but they will also ripple through time in the way people feel about where they work, the way they feel about you, the way they trust you, the way they trust the organization, whether or not, in your words, they feel psychologically safe to speak up when the moment arises. The the culture, a culture in which someone feels psychologically safe to speak up when the stakes are high, to feel psychologically safe to say, "Hey, doc, I've got to do another sponge count here real quick." The culture in which that is constructed is not at that moment in the OR. The
Right.
culture in which that is constructed is over time, through daily interaction, through the way that you process and the way that you interact with people, and the things that you do say and the way they manifest themselves throughout time and space.
That is spot on and a great way to close this out. Thank you so much for being on the show, Mike. It's been a master class on leadership. I don't care whether it's healthcare or the Army.
I appreciate that.
Uh, yeah, thank you for sharing your insights, your experiences. Thank you for protecting our Constitution and our nation. And it's just great to have you on the show.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
You have been listening to the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the Chief Medical Officer. Want to learn more about leadership? Then read Mike's essays on his Substack entitled Walking the Ridgeline, Lessons Learned in Team Building and Leader Development. Want to learn even more? Then reach out directly to Mike on LinkedIn. You'll find his insights remarkable, just as he shared on the show, and they will serve your leadership development very well. Want to learn more about your own physician leadership development and how to transform yourself and become a Chief Medical Officer? Then contact me and I'll set you up with the CMO group and everything you need to lead in healthcare. I love talking with leaders from all over the world, especially from the fabulous West Point, New York. So get out there, develop your own leadership skills, increase your influence, expand your humility, build the right consensus, be decisive, go Army, beat Navy. But remember, whatever you do, look out for yourself and be good to others out there. So long.